You could almost hear it before you tasted it. That heavy glass mug coming out of the freezer, frosted solid white, filling up with root beer that was made fresh that very morning, and a car hop walking it right out to your car window on a tray. For millions of Americans, that was summer. That was A&W. One man built the whole thing off a single nickel mug of root beer poured at a small-town parade, and it grew so big that for a while there were more A&W sitting along America's roads than there were McDonald's. And then it almost disappeared completely. This is the story of how the little root beer stand invented American fast food, lost nearly everything, and got knocked flat at one point by a hamburger that was simply too big for its own good. To really understand A&W, you have to go back to a time before fast food even existed. There was no drive-thru, there was no franchise. If you wanted a burger on the road, you stopped at a sit-down diner. The whole world we take for granted, the one built around eating in your car, hadn't been invented yet. And the man who was about to invent a huge piece of it wasn't a chef or a butcher or a baker. He ran hotels. His name was Roy Allen. And around 1918, while doing business down in Arizona, Roy met a pharmacist who told him he'd perfected a recipe for root beer. Roy tried it, and he was hooked. So he did the simplest thing imaginable. He bought the recipe outright. Now here's where Roy Allen showed the instinct that would make him a fortune. He didn't just open a shop and wait for customers to wander in. He waited for the perfect moment. On a hot June day in 1919, the small town of Lodi, California was throwing a huge parade to welcome its soldiers home from the First World War. Something like 20,000 people were expected to line those streets. And right along the parade route, Roy Allen set up a little stand and started pouring ice-cold root beer into frosty mugs for a nickel each. The mugs, and this was the whole trick, were kept in a freezer so they came out coated in white frost. On a scorching day, in front of a crowd of thousands, a frozen mug of cold. Creamy root beer was pure magic. People raved. Within days, Roy had a permanent stand and a line out front. And then, two things happened that turned a good little stand into an empire. The first was Prohibition. In 1920, America made alcohol illegal, and suddenly a cold drink with the word beer right there in the name, a drink you could enjoy without breaking a single law, was exactly what a thirsty country wanted. Root beer boomed. Roy opened a second stand in Stockton, then a handful more in Sacramento. And it was in Sacramento that Roy Allen did the thing that changed American life forever. He had his workers, they called them tray boys, carry the drinks directly out to customers who were waiting in their cars. Think about that for a second. Curbside service, carhops, the drive-in. It's being born right here in the early 1920s off the back of a root beer stand. The second big thing was a partner. At his Stockton stand, Roy had an employee named Frank Wright. In 1922, Roy brought Frank in as a full business partner. And they needed a name. So they took the first letter of each of their last names. Allen and Wright, A and W. The very next year, in 1923, they opened their first true drive-in restaurant in Sacramento. And it's worth stopping on that date, 1923. The McDonald brothers wouldn't even open their first little drive-in for another 15 years, and they wouldn't build their famous fast food system until after the Second World War. A&W was decades early. The partnership itself didn't last long. Just a couple of years later, in 1924, Roy bought Frank Wright out completely. Frank walked away, but he politely left his initial behind, and the name stuck forever. From then on, A&W was Roy Allen's show. And Roy had one more idea. The biggest one of all. He realized he didn't have to build every single restaurant himself. He could let other people open their own A&W stands using his name, his look, and most importantly, his secret root beer concentrate, which he alone would sell to them. That way, every A&W tasted exactly the same, no matter who owned it, and Roy made money on every mug poured anywhere in the country. That idea has a name today: franchising, and while people argue about the fine details, A&W is widely called the first franchised restaurant chain in America. Roy Allen didn't just build a root beer stand. He wrote the blueprint that McDonald's, Burger King, KFC, and every other giant would copy decades later. He built the machine they all still run on. And the machine worked. By 1933, there were about 170 A&W stands. Roy kept selling that concentrate, kept the recipe locked down tight, and kept the frosty mugs coming. He'd taken a nickel drink in a parade and turned it into a movement. But the empire was really just getting started. Because after the next war, A&W was about to explode across the whole country. When the soldiers came home from the Second World War, America hit the road. New cars, new highways, new suburbs, drive-in movies, a whole culture built around the automobile. And nothing on earth fit that world better than A&W. The government was handing returning veterans low-cost loans to start businesses, and a huge number of them used that money to do one thing: open an A&W. It was affordable, it was proven, and Roy Allen handed you the recipe. After the war, the number of A&W stands tripled, and a lot of the men flipping those burgers and pouring that root beer were veterans of 2 different world wars. By 1950, there were around 450 A&Ws across the country. And that year, Roy Allen, now an older man who'd built something truly extraordinary, decided to step away. He sold the whole company and retired to Southern California. He'd earned it. Roy lived another 18 quiet years before passing away in 1968. But the brand he built just kept climbing without him. And this is the part you probably remember. This was the golden age. Picture it. It's a warm evening, and you turn your car off the road into the A&W lot under the glow of that orange and brown sign. You don't even get out. You roll your window down, and a car hop comes right to you, sometimes on roller skates, and hooks a metal tray straight onto your door. And then it arrives. That mug. Not plastic, not paper. Thick, heavy glass, so cold it's frosted white all the way down, and inside it, root beer that was brewed fresh in that very building that morning. The foam on top. The bite of it. There was nothing else quite like it. The food came out on that same tray, and A&W leaned all the way into being a family place. They even built the menu around it, and people still smile about this one. The burgers came as a whole family. There was the Papa Burger, the big one, the Mama Burger, the Teen Burger with the bacon, and the little baby burger for the kids in the back seat. A whole family of hamburgers to match the family sitting there in the car. And then, of course, the root beer float. That perfect tall glass of cold root beer poured over vanilla ice cream. The ice cream fizzing up into foam at the top. For a couple of generations of American kids, that float was the greatest thing money could buy. That was the magic of it. It wasn't really a restaurant. It was a summer evening you could drive right into. The jingle on the radio, the car hop at the window, the frost on the glass, your whole family together in one car. A&W wasn't selling burgers and root beer. It was selling that feeling. And for a long stretch of the 1950s and 60s, it felt like it would last forever. In 1974, A&W introduced a character who'd become the face of the whole brand, a big, friendly, orange sweater-wearing character called the Great Root Bear, with a jingle people would hum for decades. And 1974 was, in a lot of ways, the very top of the mountain. By that year, A&W had grown to around 2,400 restaurants. And here's the fact that stops people cold. For a stretch of time, there were more A&W restaurants along America's roads than there were McDonald's. The little root beer stand from Lodi had become one of the biggest restaurant chains in the entire country. That should have been a launching pad. Instead, it turned out to be the peak. Because right there at the top, the cracks started to show. If you're enjoying this ride back, take 1 second and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next American classic we bring back to life. There are a lot of these stories, and we don't leave them online forever. The trouble started with the very thing that had built A&W in the first place, the franchise system. In the early days, Roy Allen kept the rules loose. Franchisees could pretty much run their own place their own way as long as they bought his concentrate. That freedom helped A&W spread fast. But by the 1970s, it meant every A&W was a little different. Different menus, different quality, different buildings. There was no tight, consistent system like the one McDonald's was running with military precision. When the newer corporate owners tried to modernize, to bring in royalty payments and strict new standards, a lot of the old-time franchise owners pushed back hard. Their original agreements, some of them 20 or 25 years long, were running out, and many of them simply refused the new terms and walked away. There was anger, there was a lawsuit, there was inconsistency everywhere. The chain started to flounder and locations began to close. By 1980, A&W had fallen from that peak of 2,400 restaurants down to around 1,300 in the United States. Nearly half of them gone in just a few years. And into this mess, in 1982, stepped a new owner. A wealthy real estate developer named Alfred Taubman, a man who'd made his fortune building shopping malls. Taubman looked at A&W and saw a faded classic he could revive. He had a plan to take the fight straight to McDonald's. And that plan became one of the most famous marketing disasters in all of American history. Here was the idea. McDonald's had its quarter pounder, a quarter pound of beef, and it was a monster hit. So Taubman's A&W built a bigger, better burger, a full third of a pound of beef. And in blind taste tests, people actually preferred the taste of the A&W burger. Then, A&W did the boldest part of all. They priced their bigger, third-pound burger at the exact same price as McDonald's smaller quarter-pound burger. More beef, better taste, same money. They called the campaign "Third is the Word," and they poured money into television and radio. It should have crushed McDonald's. Instead, it just sat there. The burgers didn't sell. And nobody inside A&W could figure out why. So Taubman brought in a market research firm to run focus groups and get to the bottom of it. And what they found was almost impossible to believe. The customers were doing the math and getting it wrong. Person after person complained that A&W was ripping them off. Why, they asked, should we pay the same price for a third of a pound as we do for a quarter pound at McDonald's? More than half the people in those focus groups genuinely believed that 1/3 of a pound was smaller than 1/4 of a pound, because 3 is a smaller number than 4. Let that sink in. A&W had the bigger burger, the better burger, at the very same price, and it lost. Not to a better product. It lost to a country that couldn't do fractions. The company quietly pulled the burger. And Taubman years later wrote about it in his own book as a hard lesson in how the message you think you're sending is not always the message people actually receive. It's a funny story now, but underneath the joke was something serious. A&W was throwing everything it had at McDonald's, and it was losing anyway. And the hardest years were still ahead. Through the 1980s and 90s, A&W got passed around the corporate world like a used car. First, the company got split clean in two. The root beer, the drink itself, became one business. The restaurants became another. They were cut apart and sold to different owners. That famous A&W root beer you can still buy in a bottle at the grocery store, it ended up owned by a giant beverage company, completely separate from the restaurants that made it famous. The drink and the drive-in, torn apart. The restaurants kept getting handed off, and in 2002, they landed inside one of the biggest restaurant companies on earth, the corporation behind KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut. On paper, that sounds like a rescue. In reality, it was the beginning of the end, because inside that giant, A&W was an afterthought. The strategy became co-branding, sticking a small A&W counter inside a KFC, sharing the same building. And in those shared restaurants, A&W was almost always the second fiddle. It lost control of its own kitchens, its own quality, its own identity. Same-store sales fell for 7 years in a row. A major magazine flat-out predicted A&W was about to die. And honestly, it looked right. Then in 2011, the corporate owner announced it was selling A&W off. It just didn't fit their future anymore. America's oldest franchise chain, the company that invented the drive-in, was up for sale, 92 years after that first frosty mug in Lodi. And here's where the story finally turns. The people who bought A&W weren't another faceless corporation. They were the franchise owners themselves. A group of the very people who ran the restaurants, who'd watched the brand they loved get neglected for years, banded together, formed a partnership, and bought the whole company back. On that day, A&W became something almost unheard of in fast food. A major chain owned 100% by its own franchisees. And they immediately went back to basics. They started tearing up the co-branding strategy and building proud standalone A&W restaurants again. They refused to chase the endless deep discount price wars everybody else was fighting and bet on quality instead. And, best of all, they went back to making the root beer fresh, in the restaurant, in the frosty mug, the exact way Roy Allen did it back in 1919. It worked. After 7 straight years of decline, A&W's sales started climbing again. And then they kept climbing, year after year. The brand that a magazine had left for dead was suddenly one of the quiet comeback stories in the entire industry. They even learned to laugh at their own history, teasing that old third-pound fraction fiasco right there in their new marketing. Finally having a little fun with the burger that basic math had killed. Today, A&W is smaller than it was at that towering 1970s peak. There are a few hundred locations across the United States, plus hundreds more overseas, and up in Canada, A&W split off decades ago into a completely separate, independently owned company, and it has absolutely thrived. Growing into one of the biggest burger chains in the whole country, still serving that root beer in a frosted mug. So the little root beer stand didn't die. It got knocked down, carved up, neglected, and very nearly buried. And then it got back up. A&W will probably never be bigger than McDonald's again. That mountaintop moment is history. But this is a company that invented the drive-in, invented the American food franchise, survived Prohibition, survived 2 world wars, survived a fraction it couldn't overcome, and survived a corporate owner that almost let it fade away entirely. And it's still here. Still pouring root beer into a frozen mug on a hot day, the exact same way it started. Back at that homecoming parade in 1919. Not bad for a recipe a hotel man bought off a pharmacist for pocket change. So I want to hear from you. Do you remember pulling into an A&W as a kid? That heavy frosted mug, the carhop at the window, the whole burger family on one tray? Tell me your memory down in the comments, I read them. And be honest about one thing. If you saw that third-pound burger sitting next to a quarter-pounder today, are you completely sure you'd have known which one was bigger? If you want more stories about the places and the brands that built growing up in America, the ones that made it and the ones that almost didn't, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.